Chapter 8. Is Cyrus Smith alive? NEB's story, Footprints, an insoluble question, the first words of Smith, comparing the footprints, returned to the chimneys, Pencroff. Dejected. NEB did not move. The sailor uttered one word. Living. He cried. The negro did not answer. Spilett and Pencroff turned pale. Herbert, clasping his hands, stood motionless. But it was evident that the poor negro, overcome by grief, had neither seen his companions nor heard the voice of the sailor. The reporter knelt down beside the motionless body, and, having opened the clothing, pressed his ear to the chest of the engineer. A minute, which seemed an age, passed, during which he tried to detect some movement of the heart. NEB raised up a little, and looked on as if in a trance. Overcome by exhaustion, prostrate by grief, the poor fellow was hardly recognizable. He believed his master dead. Gideon Spilett, after a long and attentive examination, rose up. He lives, he said. Pencroff, in his turn, knelt down beside Cyrus Smith. He also detected some heartbeats, and a slight breath issuing from the lips of the engineer. Herbert, at a word from the reporter, hurried in search of water. 100 paces off he found a clear brook swollen by the late rains and filtered by the sand. But there was nothing, not even a shell, in which to carry the water, so the lad had to content himself with soaking his handkerchief in the stream, and hastened back with it to the cave. Happily the handkerchief held sufficient for Spilett's purpose, which was simply to moisten the lips of the engineer. The drops of fresh water produced an instantaneous effect. A sigh escaped from the breast of Smith, and it seemed as if he attempted to speak. "We shall save him," said the reporter. NEB took heart at these words. He removed the clothing from his master to see if his body was anywhere wounded. But neither on his head nor body nor limbs was there a bruise or even a scratch, an astonishing circumstance, since he must have been tossed about among the rocks. Even his hands were uninjured, and it was difficult to explain how the engineer should exhibit no mark of the efforts which he must have made in getting over the reef. But the explanation of this circumstance would come later, when Cyrus Smith could speak. At present, it was necessary to restore his consciousness, and it was probable that this result could be accomplished by friction. For this purpose they made use of the sailor's pea jacket. The engineer, warmed by this rude rubbing, moved his arms slightly, and his breathing began to be more regular. He was dying from exhaustion, and, doubtless, had not the reporter and his companions arrived, it would have been all over with Cyrus Smith. "You thought he was dead?" asked the sailor. "Yes, I thought so," answered NEB. "And if Top had not found you and brought you back, I would have buried my master and died beside him." The engineer had had a narrow escape. Then NEB told them what had happened. The day before, after having left the chimneys at daybreak, he had followed along the coast in a direction due north, until he reached that part of the beach which he had already visited. There, though, as he said, without hope of success, he searched the shore, the rocks, the sand for any marks that could guide him, examining most carefully that part which was above high water mark, as below that point the ebb and flow of the tide would have effaced all traces. He did not hope to find his master living. It was the discovery of the body which he sought, that he might bury it with his own hands. He searched a long time, without success. It seemed as if nothing human had ever been upon that desolate shore. Of the millions of shellfish lying out of reach of the tide, not a shell was broken. There was no sign of a landing having ever been made there. The negro then decided to continue some miles further up the coast. It was possible that the currents had carried the body to some distant point. For NEB knew that a corpse, floating a little distance from a low shore, was almost certain, sooner or later, to be thrown upon the strand, and he was desirous to look upon his master one last time. "I followed the shore 2 miles further, looking at it at low and high water, hardly hoping to find anything, when yesterday evening, about 5 o'clock, I discovered footprints upon the sand." "Footprints?" cried Pencroff. "Yes, sir," replied NEB. "And did they begin at the water?" demanded the reporter. "No," answered the negro, "above high water mark, below that the tide had washed out the others." "Go on," NEB said Spilett. The sight of these footprints made me wild with joy. They were very plain, and went towards the downs. I followed them for a quarter of an hour, running so as not to tread on them. 5 minutes later, as it was growing dark, I heard a dog bark. It was Top. And he brought me here, to my master. Neb finished his recital by telling of his grief at the discovery of the inanimate body. He had tried to discover some signs of life still remaining in it. But all his efforts were in vain. There was nothing, therefore, to do but to perform the last offices to him whom he had loved so well. Then he thought of his companions. They, too, would wish to look once more upon their comrade. Top was there. Could he not rely upon the sagacity of that faithful animal? So having pronounced several times the name of the reporter, who, of all the engineer's companions, was best known by Top, and having at the same time motioned towards the south, the dog bounded off in the direction indicated. We have seen how, guided by an almost supernatural instinct, the dog had arrived at the chimneys. Neb's companions listened to his story with the greatest attention. How the engineer had been able to reach this cave in the midst of the downs, more than a mile from the beach, was as inexplicable as was his escape from the waves and rocks without a scratch. So you, Neb, said the reporter, did not bring your master to this place? No, it was not I, answered Neb. He certainly could not have come alone, said Pencroff. But he must have done it, though it does not seem credible, said the reporter. They must wait for the solution of the mystery until the engineer could speak. Fortunately the rubbing had re-established the circulation of the blood, and life was returning. Smith moved his arm again, then his head, and a second time some incoherent words escaped his lips. Neb, leaning over him, spoke, but the engineer seemed not to hear, and his eyes remained closed. Life was revealing itself by movement, but consciousness had not yet returned. Pencroff had, unfortunately, forgotten to bring the burnt linen, which could have been ignited with a couple of flints, and without it they had no means of making a fire. The pockets of the engineer were empty of everything but his watch. It was therefore the unanimous opinion that Cyrus Smith must be carried to the chimneys as soon as possible. Meantime the attention lavished on the engineer restored him to consciousness sooner than could have been hoped. The moistening of his lips had revived him, and Pencroff conceived the idea of mixing some of the juice of the tetras with water. Herbert ran to the shore and brought back 2 large shells, and the sailor made a mixture which they introduced between the lips of the engineer, who swallowed it with avidity. His eyes opened. Neb and the reporter were leaning over him. "My master! My master!" cried Neb. The engineer heard him. He recognized Neb and his companions, and his hand gently pressed theirs. Again he spoke some words, doubtless the same which he had before uttered, and which indicated that some thoughts were troubling him. This time the words were understood. "Island or continent?" he murmured. "What the devil do we care?" cried Pencroff, unable to restrain the exclamation, "now that you are alive, sir. Island or continent? We will find that out later." The engineer made a motion in the affirmative, and then seemed to sleep. Taking care not to disturb him, the reporter set to work to provide the most comfortable means of moving him. Neb, Herbert, and Pencroff left the cave and went towards a high down on which were some gnarled trees. On the way the sailor kept repeating, "Island or continent? To think of that, at his last gasp. What a man!" Having reached the top of the down, Pencroff and his companions tore off the main branches from a tree, a sort of sea pine, sickly and stunted. And with these branches they constructed a litter, which they covered with leaves and grass. This work occupied some little time, and it was 10 o'clock when the 3 returned to Smith and Spilett. The engineer had just wakened from the sleep, or rather stupor, in which they had found him. The color had come back to his lips, which had been as pale as death. He raised himself slightly, and looked about, as if questioning where he was. "Can you listen to me without being tired, Cyrus?" asked the reporter. "Yes," responded the engineer. "I think," said the sailor, "that Mr. Smith can listen better after having taken some more of this tetra jelly. It is really tetra, sir," he continued, as he gave him some of the mixture, to which he had this time added some of the meat of the bird. Cyrus Smith swallowed these bits of tetra, and the remainder was eaten by his companions, who were suffering from hunger, and who found the repast light enough. "Well," said the sailor, "there are victuals waiting for us at the Chimneys, for you must know, Mr. Smith, that to the south of here we have a house with rooms and beds and fireplace, and in the pantry dozens of birds which our Herbert calls coracoes. Your litter is ready, and whenever you feel strong enough we will carry you to our house." "Thanks, my friend," replied the engineer, "in an hour or two we will go. And now, Spilett, continue." The reporter related everything that had happened, recounting the events unknown to Smith, the last plunge of the balloon, the landing upon this unknown shore, its deserted appearance, the discovery of the Chimneys, the search for the engineer, the devotion of Neb, and what they owed to Top's intelligence, etc. "But," asked Smith, in a feeble voice, "you did not pick me up on the beach?" "No," replied the reporter. "And it was not you who brought me to this hollow?" "No." "How far is this place from the reef?" "At least half a mile," replied Pencroff, "and if you are astonished, we are equally surprised to find you here." "It is indeed singular," said the engineer, who was gradually reviving and taking interest in these details. "But," asked the sailor, "cannot you remember anything that happened after you were washed away by that heavy sea?" Cyrus Smith tried to think, but he remembered little. The wave had swept him from the net of the balloon, and at first he had sunk several fathoms. Coming up to the surface, he was conscious, in the half-light, of something struggling beside him. It was Top, who had sprung to his rescue. Looking up, he could see nothing of the balloon, which, lightened by his and the dog's weight, had sped away like an arrow. He found himself in the midst of the tumultuous sea, more than half a mile from shore. He swam vigorously against the waves, and Top sustained him by his garments, but a strong current seized him, carrying him to the north, and, after struggling for half an hour, he sank, dragging the dog with him into the abyss. From that moment to the instant of his finding himself in the arms of his friends, he remembered nothing. "Nevertheless," said Pencroff, "you must have been cast upon the shore, and had strength enough to walk to this place, since Neb found your tracks." "Yes, that must be so," answered the engineer, reflectively. "And you have not seen any traces of inhabitants upon the shore?" "Not a sign," answered the reporter. "Moreover, if by chance someone had rescued you from the waves, why should he then have abandoned you?" "You are right, my dear Spilett." "Tell me, Neb," inquired the engineer, turning towards his servant, "it was not you, you could not have been in a trance?" "During which?" "No, that's absurd." "Do any of the footprints still remain?" "Yes, master," replied Neb, "there are some at the entrance, back of this mound, in a place sheltered from the wind and rain, but the others have been obliterated by the storm." "Pencroff," said Cyrus, "will you take my shoes and see if they fit those footprints exactly?" The sailor did as he had been asked. He and Herbert, guided by Neb, went to where the marks were, and in their absence Smith said to the reporter, "That is a thing passing belief." "Inexplicable, indeed," answered the other. "But do not dwell upon it at present, my dear Spilett, we will talk of it hereafter." At this moment the others returned. All doubt was set at rest. The shoes of the engineer fitted the tracks exactly. Therefore it must have been Smith himself who had walked over the sand. So he said, "I was the one in a trance, and not Neb. I must have walked like a somnambulist, without consciousness, and Top's instinct brought me here after he rescued me from the waves. Here, Top. Come here, dog." The splendid animal sprang, barking, to his master, and caresses were lavished upon him. It was agreed that there was no other way to account for the rescue than by giving Top the credit of it. Towards noon, Pencroff having asked Smith if he felt strong enough to be carried, the latter, for answer, by an effort which showed his strength of will, rose to his feet. But if he had not leaned upon the sailor he would have fallen. "Capital," said Pencroff. "Summon the engineer's carriage." The litter was brought. The cross branches had been covered with moss and grass, and when Smith was laid upon it they walked towards the coast, Neb and the sailor carrying him. 8 miles had to be travelled, and as they could move but slowly, and would probably have to make frequent rests, it would take 6 hours or more to reach the Chimneys. The wind was still strong, but, fortunately, it had ceased raining. From his couch, the engineer, leaning upon his arm, observed the coast, especially the part opposite the sea. He examined it without comment, but undoubtedly the aspect of the country, its contour, its forests and diverse products were noted in his mind. But after 2 hours, fatigue overcame him, and he slept upon the litter. At 5:30 the little party reached the precipice, and soon after, were before the chimneys. Stopping here, the litter was placed upon the sand without disturbing the slumber of the engineer. Pencroff saw, to his surprise, that the terrible storm of the day before had altered the aspect of the place. Rocks had been displaced. Great fragments were strewn over the sand, and a thick carpet of several kinds of seaweed covered all the shore. It was plain that the sea sweeping over the isle had reached to the base of the enormous granite curtain. Before the entrance to the chimneys the ground had been violently torn up by the action of the waves. Pencroff, seized with a sudden fear, rushed into the corridor. Returning, a moment after, he stood motionless looking at his comrades. The fire had been extinguished, the drowned cinders were nothing but mud. The charred linen, which was to serve them for tinder, had gone. The sea had penetrated every recess of the corridor, and everything was overthrown, everything was destroyed within the chimneys. Chapter 9. Cyrus is here. Pencroff's attempts, rubbing wood. Island or continent, the plans of the engineer. Whereabouts in the Pacific, in the depths of the forest. The pistachio pine, a pig chase, a smoke of good omen. In a few words the others were informed of what had happened. This accident, which portended serious results, at least Pencroff foresaw such, affected each one differently. Neb, overjoyed in having recovered his master, did not listen or did not wish to think of what Pencroff said. Herbert shared in a measure the apprehensions of the sailor. As to the reporter, he simply answered, "Upon my word, Pencroff, I don't think it matters much. But I tell you again, we have no fire. Pshaw! Nor any means of lighting one. Absurd. But, Mr. Spilett, is not Cyrus here?" asked the reporter. "Isn't he alive? He will know well enough how to make fire." "And with what?" "With nothing." What could Pencroff answer? He had nothing to say, as, in his heart, he shared his companion's confidence in Cyrus Smith's ability. To them the engineer was a microcosm, a compound of all science and all knowledge. They were better off on a desert island with Cyrus than without him in the busiest city of the Union. With him they could want for nothing, with him they would have no fear. If they had been told that a volcanic eruption would overwhelm the land, sinking it into the depths of the Pacific, the imperturbable answer of these brave men would have been, "Have we not Cyrus?" Meantime, the engineer had sunk into a lethargy, the result of the journey, and his help could not be asked for just then. The supper, therefore, would be very meager. All the tetras had been eaten, there was no way to cook other birds, and, finally, the coracoes which had been reserved had disappeared. Something, therefore, must be done. First of all, Cyrus Smith was carried into the main corridor. There they were able to make for him a couch of seaweeds, and, doubtless, the deep sleep in which he was plunged, would strengthen him more than an abundant nourishment. With night the temperature, which the northwest wind had raised, again became very cold, and, as the sea had washed away the partitions which Pencroff had constructed, draughts of air made the place scarcely habitable. The engineer would therefore have been in a bad plight if his companions had not covered him with clothing which they took from themselves. The supper this evening consisted of the inevitable lithodomes, an ample supply of which Herbert and Neb had gathered from the beach. To these the lad had added a quantity of edible seaweed which clung to the high rocks and were only washed by the highest tides. These seaweeds, belonging to the family of Fucaceae, were a species of sargassum, which, when dry, furnish a gelatinous substance full of nutritive matter, much used by the natives of the Asiatic coast. After having eaten a quantity of lithodomes the reporter and his companions sucked some of the seaweed, which they agreed was excellent. "Nevertheless," said the sailor, "it is time for Mr. Smith to help us." Meantime the cold became intense, and, unfortunately, they had no means of protecting themselves. The sailor, much worried, tried every possible means of procuring a fire. He had found some dry moss, and by striking two stones together he obtained sparks, But the moss was not sufficiently inflammable to catch fire, nor had the sparks the strength of those struck by a steel. The operation amounted to nothing. Then Pencroff, although he had no confidence in the result, tried rubbing two pieces of dry wood together, after the manner of the savages. It is true that the motion of the man, if it could have been turned into heat, according to the new theory, would have heated the boiler of a steamer. But it resulted in nothing except putting him in a glow, and making the wood hot. After half an hour's work Pencroff was in a perspiration, and he threw away the wood in disgust. "When you can make me believe that savages make fire after that fashion," said he, "it will be hot in winter. I might as well try to light my arms by rubbing them together." But the sailor was wrong to deny the feasibility of this method. The savages frequently do light wood in this way. But it requires particular kinds of wood, and, moreover, the knack, and Pencroff had not this knack. Pencroff's ill humor did not last long. The bits of wood which he had thrown away had been picked up by Herbert, who exerted himself to rub them well. The strong sailor could not help laughing at the boy's weak efforts to accomplish what he had failed in. "Rub away, my boy, rub hard," he cried. "I am rubbing them," answered Herbert, laughing, "but only to take my turn at getting warm, instead of sitting here shivering, and pretty soon I will be as hot as you are, Pencroff." This was the case, and though it was necessary for this knight to give up trying to make a fire, Spilett, stretching himself upon the sand in one of the passages, repeated for the 20th time that Smith could not be baffled by such a trifle. The others followed his example, and Top slept at the feet of his master. The next day, the 28th of March, when the engineer awoke, about 8 o'clock, he saw his companions beside him watching, and, as on the day before, his first words were, "Island or continent?" It was his one thought. "Well, Mr. Smith," answered Pencroff, "we don't know. You haven't found out yet." "But we will," affirmed Pencroff, "when you are able to guide us in this country." "I believe that I am able to do that now," answered the engineer, who, without much effort, rose up and stood erect. "That is good," exclaimed the sailor. "I am dying of hunger," responded Smith. "Give me some food, my friend, and I will feel better. You've fire, haven't you?" This question met with no immediate answer. But after some moments the sailor said, "No, sir, we have no fire, at least, not now." And he related what had happened the day before. He amused the engineer by recounting the history of their solitary match, and their fruitless efforts to procure fire like the savages. "We will think about it," answered the engineer, "and if we cannot find something like tinder—" "Well?" asked the sailor. "Well, we will make matches. Friction matches. Friction matches." "It's no more difficult than that," cried the reporter, slapping the sailor on the shoulder. The latter did not see that it would be easy, but he said nothing, and all went out of doors. The day was beautiful. A bright sun was rising above the sea horizon, its rays sparkling and glistening on the granite wall. After having cast a quick look about him, the engineer seated himself upon a rock. Herbert offered him some handfuls of mussels and seaweed, saying, "It is all that we have, Mr. Smith." "Thank you, my boy," answered he, "it is enough, for this morning, at least." And he ate with appetite this scanty meal, washing it down with water brought from the river in a large shell. His companions looked on without speaking. Then, after having satisfied himself, he crossed his arms and said, "Then, my friends, you do not yet know whether we have been thrown upon an island or a continent?" "No, sir," answered Herbert. "We will find out tomorrow," said the engineer. "Until then there is nothing to do." "There is one thing," suggested Pencroff. "What is that?" "Some fire," replied the sailor, who thought of nothing else. "We will have it, Pencroff," said Smith. "But when you were carrying me here yesterday, did not I see a mountain rising in the west?" "Yes," said Spilett, "quite a high one." "All right," exclaimed the engineer. "Tomorrow we will climb to its summit and determine whether this is an island or a continent. Until then, I repeat, there is nothing to do." "But there is, we want fire," cried the obstinate sailor again. "Have a little patience, Pencroff, and we will have the fire," said Spilett. The other looked at the reporter as much as to say, if there was only you to make it we would never taste roast meat. But he kept silent. Smith had not spoken. He seemed little concerned about this question of fire. For some moments he remained absorbed in his own thoughts. Then he spoke as follows. My friends, our situation is, doubtless, deplorable, nevertheless it is very simple. Either we are upon a continent, and, in that case, at the expense of greater or less fatigue, we will reach some inhabited place, or else we are on an island. In the latter case, it is one of two things: if the island is inhabited, we will get out of our difficulty by the help of the inhabitants; if it is deserted, we will get out of it by ourselves. Nothing could be plainer than that, said Pencroff. But asked Spilett, whether it is a continent or an island, whereabouts do you think this storm has thrown us, Cyrus? In truth, I cannot say, replied the engineer, but the probability is that we are somewhere in the Pacific. When we left Richmond the wind was northeast, and its very violence proves that its direction did not vary much. Supposing it unchanged, we crossed North and South Carolina, Georgia, the Gulf of Mexico, and the narrow part of Mexico, and a portion of the Pacific Ocean. I do not estimate the distance traversed by the balloon at less than 6,000 or 7,000 miles, and even if the wind had varied a half a quarter it would have carried us either to the Marquesas Islands or to the Low Archipelago, or, if it was stronger than I suppose, as far as New Zealand. If this last hypothesis is correct, our return home will be easy. English or Maoris, we shall always find somebody with whom to speak. If, on the other hand, this coast belongs to some barren island in the Micronesian archipelago, perhaps we can reconnoiter it from the summit of this mountain, and then we will consider how to establish ourselves here as if we were never going to leave it. Never! Cried the reporter. Do you say never, my dear Cyrus? It is better to put things in their worst light at first, answered the engineer. And to reserve those which are better, as a surprise. Well said, replied Pencroff. And we hope that this island, if it is an island, will not be situated just outside of the route of ships, for that would, indeed, be unlucky. We will know how to act after having first ascended the mountain, answered Smith. But will you be able, Mr. Smith, to make the climb tomorrow? Asked Herbert. I hope so, answered the engineer, if Pencroff and you, my boy, show yourselves to be good and ready hunters. Mr. Smith, said the sailor, since you are speaking of game, if when I come back I am as sure of getting it roasted as I am of bringing it. Bring it, nevertheless, interrupted Smith. It was now agreed that the engineer and the reporter should spend the day at the Chimneys, in order to examine the shore and the plateau, while Neb, Herbert, and the sailor were to return to the forest, renew the supply of wood, and lay hands on every bird and beast that should cross their path. So, at 6 o'clock, the party left, Herbert confident, Neb happy, and Pencroff muttering to himself, if, when I get back I find a fire in the house, it will have been the lightning that lit it. The three climbed the bank, and having reached the turn in the river, the sailor stopped and said to his companions, Shall we begin as hunters or wood choppers? Hunters, answered Herbert. See Top, who is already at it. Let us hunt, then, replied the sailor, and on our return here we will lay in our stock of wood. This said, the party made 3 clubs for themselves, and followed Top, who was jumping about in the high grass. This time, the hunters, instead of following the course of the stream, struck at once into the depths of the forests. The trees were for the most part of the pine family. And in certain places, where they stood in small groups, they were of such a size as to indicate that this country was in a higher latitude than the engineer supposed. Some openings, bristling with stumps decayed by the weather, were covered with dead timber which formed an inexhaustible reserve of firewood. Then, the opening passed, the underwood became so thick as to be nearly impenetrable. To guide oneself among these great trees without any beaten path was very difficult. So the sailor from time to time blazed the route by breaking branches in a manner easily recognizable. But perhaps they would have done better to have followed the watercourse, as in the first instance, as, after an hour's march, no game had been taken. Top, running under the low boughs, only flushed birds that were unapproachable. Even the couroucous were invisible, and it seemed likely that the sailor would be obliged to return to that swampy place where he had fished for tetras with such good luck. Well, Pencroff said Neb sarcastically, if this is all the game you promised to carry back to my master, it won't take much fire to roast it. Wait a bit, Neb answered the sailor, it won't be game that will be wanting on our return. Don't you believe in Mr. Smith? Yes. But you don't believe B will make a fire. I will believe that when the wood is blazing in the fireplace. It will blaze, then, for my master has said so. Well, we'll see. Meanwhile the sun had not yet risen to its highest point above the horizon. The exploration went on and was signalized by Herbert's discovery of a tree bearing edible fruit. It was the pistachio pine, which bears an excellent nut, much liked in the temperate regions of America and Europe. These nuts were perfectly ripe, and Herbert showed them to his companions, who feasted on them. Well, said Pencroff, seaweed for bread, raw mussels for meat, and nuts for dessert, that's the sort of dinner for men who haven't a match in their pocket. It's not worthwhile complaining, replied Herbert. I don't complain, my boy. I simply repeat that the meat is a little too scant in this sort of meal. Top has seen something, cried Neb, running toward a thicket into which the dog had disappeared, barking. With the dog's barks were mingled singular gruntings. The sailor and Herbert had followed the negro. If it was game, this was not the time to discuss how to cook it, but rather how to secure it. The hunters, on entering the brush, saw Top struggling with an animal which he held by the ear. This quadruped was a species of pig, about 2.5 feet long, of a brownish-black color, somewhat lighter under the belly, having harsh and somewhat scanty hair, and its toes at this time strongly grasping the soil seemed joined together by membranes. Herbert thought that he recognized in this animal a cabiai, or water hog, one of the largest specimens of the order of rodents. The water hog did not fight the dog. Its great eyes, deep sunk in thick layers of fat, rolled stupidly from side to side. And Neb, grasping his club firmly, was about to knock the beast down, when the latter tore loose from Top, leaving a piece of his ear in the dog's mouth, and uttering a vigorous grunt, rushed against and overset Herbert and disappeared in the wood. The beggar! Cried Pencroff, as they all three darted after the hog. But just as they had come up to it again, the water hog disappeared under the surface of a large pond, overshadowed by tall, ancient pines. The three companions stopped, motionless. Top had plunged into the water, but the cabiai, hidden at the bottom of the pond, did not appear. Wait, said the boy, he will have to come to the surface to breathe. Won't he drown? Asked Neb. No, answered Herbert, since he is fin-toed and almost amphibious. But watch for him. Top remained in the water, and Pencroff and his companions took stations upon the bank, to cut off the animal's retreat, while the dog swam to and fro looking for him. Herbert was not mistaken. In a few minutes the animal came again to the surface. Top was upon him at once, keeping him from diving again, and a moment later, the cabiai, dragged to the shore, was struck down by a blow from Neb's club. Hurrah! Cried Pencroff with all his heart. Nothing but a clear fire, and this gnawer shall be gnawed to the bone. Pencroff lifted the carcass to his shoulder, and judging by the sun that it must be near 2 o'clock, he gave the signal to return. Top's instinct was useful to the hunters, as, thanks to that intelligent animal, they were enabled to return upon their steps. In half an hour they had reached the bend of the river. There, as before, Pencroff quickly constructed a raft, although, lacking fire, this seemed to him a useless job, and, with the raft keeping the current, they returned towards the Chimneys. But the sailor had not gone 50 paces when he stopped and gave utterance anew to a tremendous hurrah, and extending his hand towards the angle of the cliff. Herbert! Neb! See! He cried. Smoke was escaping and curling above the rocks. Chapter X. The engineer's invention, island or continent. Departure for the mountain, the forest, volcanic soil. The Tragopans, the Mouflons, the first plateau. Encamping for the night, the summit of the cone. A few minutes afterwards, the three hunters were seated before a sparkling fire. Beside them sat Cyrus Smith and the reporter. Pencroff looked from one to the other without saying a word, his cabiai in his hand. Yes, my good fellow, said the reporter, a fire, a real fire, that will roast your game to a turn. But who lighted it? Said the sailor. The sun. The sailor could not believe his eyes, and was too stupefied to question the engineer. Had you a burning glass, sir? Asked Herbert of Cyrus Smith. No, my boy, said he, but I made one. And he showed his extemporized lens. It was simply the two glasses, from his own watch and the reporter's, which he had taken out, filled with water, and stuck together at the edges with a little clay. Thus he had made a veritable burning glass, and by concentrating the solar rays on some dry moss had set it on fire. The sailor examined the lens, then he looked at the engineer without saying a word, but his face spoke for him. If Smith was not a magician to him, he was certainly more than a man. At last his speech returned, and he said, "Put that down, Mr. Spilett, put that down in your book." "I have it down," said the reporter. Then, with the help of Neb, the sailor arranged the spit, and dressed the cabiai for roasting, like a suckling pig, before the sparkling fire, by whose warmth, and by the restoration of the partitions, the chimneys had been rendered habitable. The engineer and his companion had made good use of their day. Smith had almost entirely recovered his strength, which he had tested by climbing the plateau above. From thence his eye, accustomed to measure heights and distances, had attentively examined the cone whose summit he proposed to reach on the morrow. The mountain, situated about 6 miles to the northwest, seemed to him to reach about 3,500 feet above the level of the sea, so that an observer posted at its summit could command a horizon of 50 miles at least. He hoped, therefore, for an easy solution of the urgent question, island or continent. They had a pleasant supper, and the meat of the cabiai was proclaimed excellent. The sargassum yum and pistachio nuts completed the repast. But the engineer said little, he was planning for the next day. Once or twice Pencroff talked of some project for the future, but Smith shook his head. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will know how we are situated, and we can act accordingly." After supper, more armfuls of wood were thrown on the fire, and the party lay down to sleep. The morning found them fresh and eager for the expedition which was to settle their fate. Everything was ready. Enough was left of the cabiai for 24 hours. Provisions, and they hoped to replenish their stock on the way. They charred a little linen for tinder, as the watch glasses had been replaced, and flint abounded in this volcanic region. At 7:30 they left the Chimneys, each with a stout cudgel. By Pencroff's advice, they took the route of the previous day, which was the shortest way to the mountain. They turned the southern angle, and followed the left bank of the river, leaving it where it bent to the southwest. They took the beaten path under the evergreens, and soon reached the northern border of the forest. The soil, flat and swampy, then dry and sandy, rose by a gradual slope towards the interior. Among the trees appeared a few shy animals, which rapidly took flight before Top. The engineer called his dog back. Later, perhaps, they might hunt, but now nothing could distract him from his great object. He observed neither the character of the ground nor its products, he was going straight for the top of the mountain. At 10 o'clock they were clear of the forest, and they halted for a while to observe the country. The mountain was composed of 2 cones. The first was truncated about 2,500 feet up, and supported by fantastic spurs, branching out like the talons of an immense claw, laid upon the ground. Between these spurs were narrow valleys, thick-set with trees, whose topmost foliage was level with the flat summit of the first cone. On the northeast side of the mountain, vegetation was more scanty, and the ground was seamed here and there, apparently with currents of lava. On the first cone lay a second, slightly rounded towards the summit. It lay somewhat across the other, like a huge hat cocked over the ear. The surface seemed utterly bare, with reddish rocks often protruding. The object of the expedition was to reach the top of this cone, and their best way was along the edge of the spurs. "We are in a volcanic country," said Cyrus Smith, as they began to climb, little by little, up the side of the spurs, whose winding summit would most readily bring them out upon the lower plateau. The ground was strewn with traces of igneous convulsion. Here and there lay blocks, debris of basalt, pumice stone, and obsidian. In isolated clumps rose some few of those conifers, which, some hundreds of feet lower, in the narrow gorges, formed a gigantic thicket, impenetrable to the sun. As they climbed these lower slopes, Herbert called attention to the recent marks of huge paws and hoofs on the ground. "These brutes will make a fight for their territory," said Pencroff. "Oh well," said the reporter, who had hunted tigers in India and lions in Africa, "we shall contrive to get rid of them. In the meanwhile, we must be on our guard." While talking they were gradually ascending. The way was lengthened by detours around the obstacles which could not be directly surmounted. Sometimes, too, deep crevasses yawned across the ascent, and compelled them to return upon their track for a long distance, before they could find an available pathway. At noon, when the little company halted to dine at the foot of a great clump of firs, at whose foot babbled a tiny brook, they were still halfway from the first plateau, and could hardly reach it before nightfall. From this point the sea stretched broad beneath their feet, but on the right their vision was arrested by the sharp promontory of the southeast, which left them in doubt whether there was land beyond. On the left they could see directly north for several miles, but the northwest was concealed from them by the crest of a fantastic spur, which formed a massive abutment to the central cone. They could, therefore, make no approach as yet to the solving of the great question. At 1 o'clock, the ascent was again begun. The easiest route slanted upwards towards the southwest, through the thick copse. There, under the trees, were flying about a number of gallinaceae of the pheasant family. These were tragopans adorned with a sort of fleshy wattles hanging over their necks and with two little cylindrical horns behind their eyes. Of these birds, which were about the size of a hen, the female was invariably brown, while the male was resplendent in a coat of red, with little spots of white. With a well-aimed stone Spilett killed one of the tragopans, which the hungry Pencroff looked at with longing eyes. Leaving the copse, the climbers, by mounting on each other's shoulders, ascended for 100 feet up a very steep hill, and reached a terrace, almost bare of trees, whose soil was evidently volcanic. From hence, their course was a zigzag towards the east, for the declivity was so steep that they had to take every point of vantage. Neb and Herbert led the way, then came Smith and the reporter. Pencroff was last. The animals who lived among these heights, and whose traces were not wanting, must have the sure foot and the supple spine of a chamois or an izard. They saw some to whom Pencroff gave a name of his own. "Sheep," he cried. They all had stopped 50 feet from half a dozen large animals, with thick horns curved backwards and flattened at the end, and with woolly fleece, hidden under long silky fawn-colored hair. They were not the common sheep, but a species widely distributed through the mountainous regions of the temperate zone. Their name, according to Herbert, was mouflon. "Have they legs and chops?" asked the sailor. "Yes," replied Herbert. "Then they are sheep," said Pencroff. The animals stood motionless and astonished at their first sight of man. Then, seized with sudden fear, they fled, leaping away among the rocks. "Goodbye till next time," cried Pencroff to them, in a tone so comical that the others could not forbear laughing. As the ascension continued, the traces of lava were more frequent, and little sulfur springs intercepted their route. At some points sulfur had been deposited in crystals, in the midst of the sand and whitish cinders of felspar which generally precede the eruption of lava. As they neared the first plateau, formed by the truncation of the lower cone, the ascent became very difficult. By 4 o'clock the last belt of trees had been passed. Here and there stood a few dwarfed and distorted pines, which had survived the attacks of the furious winds. Fortunately for the engineer and his party, it was a pleasant, mild day, for a high wind, at that altitude of 3,000 feet, would have interfered with them sadly. The sky overhead was extremely bright and clear. A perfect calm reigned around them. The sun was hidden by the upper mountain, which cast its shadow, like a vast screen, westward to the edge of the sea. A thin haze began to appear in the east, colored with all the rays of the solar spectrum. There were only 500 feet between the explorers and the plateau where they meant to encamp for the night, but these 500 were increased to 2,000 and more by the tortuous route. The ground, so to speak, gave way under their feet. The angle of ascent was often so obtuse that they slipped upon the smooth-worn lava. Little by little the evening set in, and it was almost night when the party, tired out by a 7 hours' climb, arrived at the top of the first cone. Now they must pitch their camp, and think of supper and sleep. The upper terrace of the mountain rose upon a base of rocks, amid which they could soon find a shelter. Firewood was not plenty, yet the moss and dry thistles, so abundant on the plateau, would serve their turn. The sailor built up a fireplace with huge stones, while Neb and Herbert went after the combustibles. They soon came back with a load of thistles, and with flint and steel, the charred linen for tinder, and Neb to blow the fire. A bright blaze was soon sparkling behind the rocks. It was for warmth only, for they kept the pheasant for the next day, and supped off the rest of the cabiai and a few dozen pistachio nuts. It was only 6:30 when the meal was ended. Cyrus Smith resolved to explore, in the semi-obscurity, the great circular pediment which upheld the topmost cone of the mountain. Before taking rest, he was anxious to know whether the base of the cone could be passed, in case its flanks should prove too steep for ascent. So, regardless of fatigue, he left Pencroff and Neb to make the sleeping arrangements, and Spilett to note down the incidents of the day, and taking Herbert with him, began to walk around the base of the plateau towards the north. The night was beautiful and still, and not yet very dark. They walked together in silence. Sometimes the plateau was wide and easy, sometimes so encumbered with rubbish that the two could not walk abreast. Finally, after 20 minutes' tramp, they were brought to a halt. From this point the slant of the two cones was equal. To walk around the mountain upon an acclivity whose angle was nearly 75 degrees was impossible. But though they had to give up their flank movement, the chance of a direct ascent was suddenly offered to them. Before them opened an immense chasm in the solid rock. It was the mouth of the upper crater, the gullet, so to speak, through which, when the volcano was active, the eruption took place. Inside, hardened lava and scoriae formed a sort of natural staircase with enormous steps, by which they might possibly reach the summit. Smith saw the opportunity at a glance, and followed by the boy, he walked unhesitatingly into the huge crevasse, in the midst of the gathering darkness. There were yet 1,000 feet to climb. Could they scale the interior wall of the crater? They would try, at all events. Fortunately, the long and sinuous declivities described a winding staircase, and greatly helped their ascent. The crater was evidently exhausted. Not a puff of smoke, not a glimmer of fire, escaped, not a sound or motion in the dark abyss, reaching down, perhaps, to the center of the globe. The air within retained no taint of sulfur. The volcano was not only quiet, but extinct. Evidently the attempt was to succeed. Gradually, as the two mounted the inner walls, they saw the crater grow larger over their heads. The light from the outer sky visibly increased. At each step, so to speak, which they made, new stars entered the field of their vision. The magnificent constellations of the southern sky shone resplendent. In the zenith glittered the splendid antares of the Scorpion, and not far off that Beta of the Centaur, which is believed to be the nearest star to our terrestrial globe. Then, as the crater opened, appeared Fomal out of the fish, the triangle, and at last, almost at the Antarctic pole, the glowing Southern Cross. It was nearly 8 o'clock when they set foot on the summit of the cone. The darkness was by this time complete, and they could hardly see a couple of miles around them. Was the land an island, or the eastern extremity of a continent? They could not yet discover. Towards the west a band of cloud, clearly defined against the horizon, deepened the obscurity, and confounded sea with sky. But at one point of the horizon suddenly appeared a vague light, which slowly sank as the clouds mounted to the zenith. It was the slender crescent of the moon, just about to disappear. But the line of the horizon was now cloudless, and as the moon touched it, the engineer could see her face mirrored for an instant on a liquid surface. He seized the boy's hand. "An island," said he, as the lunar crescent disappeared behind the waves.